also online. It's an important meeting, particularly focused on budget scrutiny and the budget proposals. So thank you to the Cabinet members who are present in the chamber and also online. It's important that we have the opportunity to understand your proposals, and as ever, the job of our committee is to ask questions rather than make long speeches or statements, but sometimes we need to make the statement before we can ask the question. But the purpose is to try and ensure that we can understand what the report is saying, try and shine a light into areas that we are not clear about. We're looking to try and see if we can actually make a contribution to a better report, and that's no different in this regard. And of course, for our residents as well as members and other councillors, and indeed staff, to ensure that we're scrutinising the report in front of us, and that's all going to be very much our focus. What we need to start with today, however, is the appointment for today of the Vice Chair. The Vice Chair, Councillor Keir, was unable to attend this morning, so Councillor Murphy, Councillor Phil Murphy, who some of you may know, has volunteered to step in as Vice Chair. Could I start the meeting by looking for a nomination, please?
Yeah, I nominate Councillor Murphy.
Thank you, Councillor Chandler. And support, Councillor Bond, thank you. So, Councillor Murphy, thank you very much. And Councillor Murphy, if you'd be kind enough to join us up here, that would be great. We'll move on to the agenda proper. I think you would have let us know by now if anyone couldn't hear clearly, but I shouldn't just take that for granted. I'm looking at faces online and I don't see anyone suggesting that it's not clear, so thank you for that. First of all, apologies. I know Councillor Pavia is going to be just a little bit delayed. He's got a school engagement first thing, but he'll be joining us. Hazel, any other apologies? Just Councillor Keir, thank you. And noted. Have we any declarations of interest for the meeting itself?
Yes, Chair, could I
Yes, Councillor Strong.
declare what I believe to be just a personal interest? Given that we're discussing library funding, I am the Chair of the Friends of Caldecott Library. I'm also Secretary of the Gwent County History Association, and we supply 5 copies of our journal twice a year to Monmouthshire libraries at a total cost of about £60. We don't make any money out of it, we make a loss, but I thought I ought to declare that.
Thank you, Councillor Strong. Library declarations are important, or they'd be throwing the book at you. Well, we may as well get started. Yeah. Anyway, so public open forum. I'm not aware of any public open forum representation. We'll then move into the budget scrutiny, item 4. In order that we try to cover this ground as fully and appropriately as possible, I understand, Councillor Garrick, that you have a presentation that you wanted to take us through to begin the meeting. Am I correct in saying that?
I can do that, sure, yeah.
Thank you very much. What I would like to do after that, if I may, is to break the report into just a few areas so that we aren't just looking at the report in one large mass. And the areas that we're going to break it into, which other colleagues on the committee have supported, is areas items 1 to 4, which is context and proposals. So we can just have a look at that in one overall area. Then number 5, item 5, which is the unmitigated budget risks, which look to us to be well worth having a specific view of. Then the medium-term forecast, which is item 6, just looking at just how this year's budget would move forward over the medium term, and that's extremely important. And then 7 to 11, item 7 to 11, which would be capital and related issues. And then 12 and to the end, which would be covering prudential as well as next steps. And there may well be some overall questions to mop up at the end of that. But if that would be agreeable to everyone, that's the way we'll approach this morning. As ever, I welcome you to raise questions as appropriate as we get to questions. And I'd be grateful if you could keep those questions reasonably or appropriately appropriate in length. I'm looking that we complete this meeting around midday, as we aim to do. So we'll try and manage the time, or I'll try and manage the time as we go through this, to ensure that each of those areas are covered. So if I do cut off anybody's questions, it's not to stop questions per se, it's just to make sure we cover enough of the agenda in time. And there may be time at the end if there are any outstanding questions. So with that in mind, we will make a start. And I think, first of all, probably over to Councillor Garrick, if you wanted to take it from here.
Absolutely. Thank you. Just loading the presentation. Can you all see the presentation on violin and in the chamber?
Certainly.
Brilliant. I've got one no from Councillor Riley. Not sure what's going on there. Everybody else seems to be affirming that they can see it.
No, just got a blank screen, black screen.
That might be a connection problem. Would it be okay if we continued without the content? The slides are mostly presenting what I'm speaking. Thank you, everybody.
Go ahead.
Councillor Garrick, I have it on another screen, so it's okay.
Fabulous.
Could I just remind everyone that you've all been sent it by email? Was that earlier this morning? So if you can't see it on screen, you might be able to pick it up on your emails. Thank you. Councillor Garrick, over to you.
Okay. So thank you very much. Obviously, I'm presenting our draft budget proposals here, and to do that, we need to set some context. So, as you're aware, this year has been unprecedented. I think we used that word heavily when I came to you to discuss the month 4 and the month 6 outturns. And it's very hard to overstate how unprecedented this year has been. Inflation sat at over 10% this year, and that's on the CPI. If you go to RPI, you can see the confirmation that actually the UK hasn't seen the level of inflation that we've seen this year since the 1970s. So what that's meant is we've had an amazing speed of inflation of costs, which in terms of last year's budget, which we inherited as an administration, meant that that budget slipped to 9 million overspent shortfall within 6 months. The causes of that have been multifactorial. We've had the cost of fuel set off by price setting through OPEC Plus, and then the Ukraine war exacerbating that. But we've also had other issues, including issues from Brexit, increasing raw material costs, food costs, hangover from the pandemic where services are being used more heavily, particularly in care from the council. And also we're seeing as we've come out of the pandemic, actually the additional funding that was made available to councils has now dried up. And so we still have responsibilities whilst not having the additional funding. We've also seen a spiralling job market. So to keep up with making sure that we can keep people to provide jobs such as care, we've had to keep pace with that job market. It's been really very challenging. And we need to put that on a backdrop of councils being underfunded, for the last 12 years through austerity. Longer term councillors here will be aware that they've had to balance tricky budgets over the years as funding hasn't been where we need it to be to provide services. If you look over the water to England, you'll see council after council announcing bankruptcy at the moment. So that totals, and I'm sure you're all very aware with the figure by now, that we're seeing unprecedented cost pressures of 26 million to be able to run and provide services to the public at the same level that we have for 2022 to 2023. Quick breakdown of where those are. 11.9 million in terms of services alone. So that's what it's costing us to run the services to provide to the general public. On top of that, we have a £4.5 million increase in energy cost, and our pay awards are at 7 million. We also have treasury costs where we're servicing the existing borrowing of 3.2 million. You're also seeing things such as the fire authority level, which is currently set at 8.3%. So this pie chart gives you an idea of the breakdown of where our spend is. So essentially what you'll see is our largest spending commitment is in children and young people. That's 32% and £59 million going into children and young people as an area. Oops, sorry, I've got ahead of myself there. So then our next biggest commitment is social care and health, and that's sitting at 58.4 million. We then go to communities place at 24.1 million, and then you can see the council tax reduction scheme comes in at 7.4 million. The borrowing costs for the councils at 7.1 million. Resources are 7 million. Mon Life is 4.9 million. Democracy, people and planning, that's 4.8 million. Policy, scrutiny and customer service, 3.2 million. And corporate management and insurance of 1.3 million. If we break down the service pressures that I've just mentioned of 11.9 million, we can see that those increases are coming from 1.8 million in adult social care. For some reason, I think there's another point at the top. Yep, there we go. Sorry, that flew in when should have flown in with everything else. So essentially, our biggest cost increase is children's social care. And as committee members, you'll be familiar with this phenomenon, having looked at the month 4 and the month 6 outturns, which has shown that actually children's social care has been the area that has caused a large amount of the shortfall this year. So it's a volatile area. We don't have sufficient children's placement. We've got increasing demand and complexity, and we're also seeing inflationary pressures and staff shortages. Our estimations is that increase is 4.4 million for 22 to 23. And again, we've got volatility. We'll talk about risk later, but it's one of the areas where it's very hard to predict where you might get a particular case that's high needs and high cost for us to provide care for. So we've got 1.8 million in adult social care. And again, we're aware that Monmouthshire is a particularly ageing population. And we've also got a lot of post-pandemic demand in terms of people needing care after experiencing and suffering COVID. As a real living wage employer, our implications there are 1 million in the next year. That also includes the response to the challenge of our market, where we have issues with recruitment and retention, particularly of carers, where it's difficult to place carers and find carers. Normally, a lot of our workers in care come from over the borders into Monmouthshire, and we've increased costs of fuel and also a spiralling job market where opportunities have been available elsewhere. It's becoming more and more difficult to recruit and retain our carers. So Welsh Government put in policy this year or last year on homelessness to request that to ensure that all councils provided a service for homelessness which was appropriate for a developed nation. Our estimations on the cost of that is 1.9 million to the council. We're also seeing children with additional learning needs increase, and the demand for support there we anticipate to increase to about £600. That's things like placement costs and actually providing support over a wider range than previously. In terms of recycling and waste, that figure's £218,000, and that applies to haulage, treatment, disposal costs, and increases, and also a fall in our waste income from trade. Passenger transport and fleet, we're looking at £612,000 increase, and that's on home to school transport, and that's again around operator costs and inflation as well as increased pupil numbers. We've got income shortfalls, and those are across our leisure income, our outdoor education income, our civil parking enforcement, our investment in property income, and that's sitting at about £800,000. We also need additional local capacity for community safety, and we're estimating that at about, it's 0.1 million there, but it's around 84k. So, with all budgets, we need to balance it. We know that the cost of delivering our services is going to increase this year by 26.6 million. That's 14%. So again, that's slightly above the CPI rate for inflation, but around what you're seeing in RPI. We've got income increases of about 15.7 million or 7.5%. So that comes from our government grant, our service charges, and our proposed council tax increase. That covers 7.5% of what we have as a council. We have the third lowest reserves in Wales, so we need to hold those as a contingency. You'll see certain councils such as Rundle, Cannon, Taff and Caerphilly County being able to dip into very high reserve levels and cover a lot of the shortfall because they've got the reserves for that rainy day. That's not a privilege we have as a council. What we're proposing is that we hold £3 million of reserves next year for risk contingencies, but actually we need to make a balance, and therefore we're proposing savings of about 11.4 million for service changes. So in terms of our approach, we want this budget to be policy and priority led. So we want to put people first, and we're looking at ways of maintaining improved quality and improving services now and in the future, with a view that actually this year we fully accept is the hardest year. We're already seeing slight signs of economic improvement, and the anticipation is, now that fuel prices are going down, that inflation will start to go down as well within 23 to 24. As the administration, we've met the challenge head on. We've risk assessed the budget proposals and gone through the impacts and those mitigations. I'm not sure who's here from Cabinet in the chamber, but they will attest to the fact that they didn't like me very much over the last couple of months when I locked them in small rooms for many, many, many days to go through all of the proposals that we'd been given by the officers line by line in order to assess and consider what's appropriate for Monmouthshire and what we cannot countenance for our residents. Let's talk about where our main proposals are. So, what we're proposing is a 5% increase, net increase, in school budgets next year. But we have a gap. It's a £26 million shortfall, and we're looking for 11.4 million of savings. So it's not the full increase that we would like to see for schools, and we do need schools to provide 2.8% efficiency savings to close that gap. We're expecting schools to actually tap into their reserves to get through this year. And when we say we're looking at that, that's a request we're making after making full provision for our pay and energy increases in the schools. In the current year, schools are picking up some of the tab for future pay increases under our budget. Unfortunately, that doesn't solve our problems, and we still need to find further savings. So we are, I think, the last council in Gwent to support Gwent Music Service with a full subsidy. We realise we cannot do that this year. So we're reducing our subsidy provision for Gwent Music Service. That means that there may be some reduced car space provision, and charges to parents may increase. We're maintaining a fund which will allow support children from low-income families to remain, because music is an important part of our heritage, and it's absolutely an important part of our culture and the culture that school children should learn. In terms of breakfast clubs, we provide a free breakfast for any child that needs it. Any child can come and have a free breakfast. We also provide subsidised childcare through breakfast clubs. At the moment, we charge £1 per session. For contrast, I think it's £6.95 that I would pay for an after-school club for my children at the same school for about the same amount of time. So it's a heavy subsidy. And what we're proposing, that we're increasing that charge to £2, which still provides a very, very low cost childcare wraparound option for families and still provides free school breakfasts. We're also looking at a rigorous grant funding strategy to offset reduced staffing levels for our school psychology service, where we're looking to reduce the cost on those, and the support service for children with additional needs. Okay, so let's move on to social care. Again, we're increasing that budget by 7% for the next year. To break that down, that's £1 million for adult social care. And we'll be looking to resize direct care for some clients and rebalancing in terms of house and external provision. We're looking to introduce a falls prevention and early intervention service to reduce the number of people being placed in nursery and residential care from home or hospital as well. We're looking to increase children's services by 3.4 million. But again, we still have a gap. So we're looking at a resource gap, which we're going to meet through proposed savings of 1.4 million. And again, we're reviewing the service delivery and implementing more cost-effective services where we can. So we'll be reevaluating processes and decisions around high-cost placements, and reviewing our family time service development and wider structures and service operating costs there. We're also looking to make a £300,000 saving by remodelling our learning disability and mental health teams. That will involve a decrease in the management hours for those teams. Moving on, we're increasing our budget for MonLife by 22%. And again, we still need savings, and those target savings are about 6.6 million, about 648 million, and about 648 648,000. Sorry, I've got to the point of word blindness with numbers. I'm very sorry, everybody. So that's a £648,000 proposed saving, and that's through service redesign, cost-saving measures, which are aimed at maintaining our service delivery within the funds that we've got. So we're talking about our leisure centres, our cultural places as well. You'll see again throughout the UK, councils proposing to shut leisure centres, to close swimming pools. The swimming pools themselves take a lot of energy to heat, and that is a high cost at this point in time. What we're doing is ensuring that we keep these services open. But we do need to consider how we keep those services open. So that will include things such as looking at the footfall and usage of our leisure centres, and where usage is low, we may look to reduce hours of availability. We're also looking at things such as reducing our mowing schedule, so expanding our nature isn't least piece. That will again reduce costs and increase biodiversity in the county. We're also looking at a further 1.3 million of savings. So again, large piece of that is reducing the level of spend of maintenance on our council buildings and vehicles. Our fleet maintenance at the moment is is significantly high and beyond safety requirements. So we're looking to drive reductions there in operating fleets through mileage and reducing the actual size of the operating fleet. Moving on, we're also looking to reduce running costs. So we're looking at decarbonisation and reducing energy consumption across the council estate to the tune of about £714,000. And then in terms of landlord services, we're looking to save £665,000, and that's from a one-off reduction in our corporate building maintenance revenue budget. So basically, we're reducing maintenance to essential only for 1 year only to get us through this intense crisis. We're also looking to rationalise our property estate and increase solar farm export tariff income. Shortening services and looking at service redesign will only get us so far. We also need to look at our income. So we will be asking residents to pay a fair price for the discretionary services that we provide. And we're looking at that to bring in an income of 1.4 million. So that's a range of fees and charges across our services, including things such as car parking, waste services. We're also committed to keep our community hubs, our libraries, and our contact centre open. Also, add to that Usk Post Office as well. We do have proposed savings as well, again, because there is a gap, but what we're not doing is shutting any of these services, where you'll see some councils across the country are. So we've got some reduction to opening hours, and again, that's based on analysis of when these services are used. So in the quietest times, those services will reduce. And we're also looking at changes impacting on the speed at which we can respond. So that means essentially less people answering the phones through the contact centre. We're also looking at other items such as a 1 year reduction in the budget for library books by 50%. And we're doing that to mitigate the impact of the staffing and allowing the service to continue as much as possible. We had a member of the public come to one of the consultation event actually in Caldecott this week and ask, can we have a drive to ask the public to donate books? And I thought that was a particularly good approach to see us through this year and a very welcome idea. So one of the things that you've been asking for as a committee for quite some time is how much do we feel we need to raise council tax? Our proposal is 5.95%. We had a very, very below inflation increase last year, and we did suffer as a council in terms of shortfall. We're also seeing a lack of compounding effect from that as well. So unfortunately, in a point in a year where we have over 10% inflation, we're asking for a below inflation increase of 5.95% on council tax. And it's been a balance between what is a tolerable level of service redesign versus what we can ask our public to pay, and also being aware that actually it's only about a third of the council funding that comes from council tax. So we're proposing a 5.95% increase, which is very much below inflation. We'll maintain the rigorous help and support for low-income households, and I thank everybody who supported and voted for the council tax rebate scheme paper that I brought to council on Thursday. And essentially, this is much needed funds that we need to be able to provide the service for the well-being and operation of the county in a functional manner. What does that mean? Well, if we look at the most common property, Band D as an example, that means an increase of exactly £1.69 per week, or £7.32 increase per month. And bear in mind, this is just the council tax from Monmouthshire. This doesn't take into account any precept from town and community councils or the police and crime commissioners levy as well. We'd like to carry the risk in the meeting later, so we've identified 9 million of. Oh, sorry. I've already spoken to you about the £9 million of risks that we had appear in the first 4 months of this budget for 2022. I've spoken repeatedly in this meeting and previous meetings about how unprecedented 2022 has been. We do not anticipate the level of increase of risk realisation to match that of 2022. We're therefore keeping £3 million of reserves available to cover the risks that we have identified. Our risks really essentially are how well we can deliver the saving proposals, what will happen on those cost and demand pressures. We have an idea of what inflation will do. We think it's going to go down somewhat. It's not going to be a sharp drop, but those are all based on best estimates. We also have uncertainty around things such as pay awards, and that uncertainty is going to remain around the pay awards for local government staff and teaching staff until we have pay deals confirmed later in 2023. We're also still not got clarity on what will be available for us in terms of specific grant funding through Welsh Government. So we know what our settlement would be. We don't know what grant funding will actually genuinely be available. We've got an idea of some grants, but a lot of it is up in the air. We also need to consider, we are talking about redundancies as part of these savings. And so redundancy and pension costs, we do need to actually undertake work to mitigate job losses and consider what those costs will be, as we do have an impact from redundancies as well. And we're unable to actually say this is an exact figure until the point that we actually agree those redundancies, so we're clear on how many people are leaving, what their redundancy entitlement is, and what we need to actually provide. So let's talk about our draft capital and budget proposals. So we're maintaining a capital programme. It oversees our maintenance and enhancement of our roads, schools, leisure centres, farms, and much, much more. And our proposal is that we continue support for our priorities, and that's in line with our draft strategic plan. We're looking to tackle the longer-term challenges that our communities are facing. And again, we're all aware that we've got some significant investment through the capital programme, principally this year on the Abergavenny School and the new care home in Crick Road itself. This is just the final slide, essentially, to explain how we're going about consultation. So we have 4 weeks of public consultation. We're doing those face-to-face and with virtual engagement events where appropriate. Those county-wide, focusing on the main population areas. And we have some targeted things such as the youth council that we'll be talking to. You'll be able to access the special budget page, as will the residents of the county, through our website. And we're running an online survey and a social media campaign to engage on both the consultation and the survey itself. We're all aware that we're doing scrutiny meetings. This is the first scrutiny meeting that we're bringing the budget to. And that final budget proposal then goes to Cabinet on the 1st of March, with a council tax setting and budget at full council on the 2nd of March. And I think, Chair, that's time for me to hand it back over to you.
Thank you, Councillor Garrick, and thank you for taking us through what is quite a complicated picture. And I know that colleagues on the committee have had the opportunity to read the report ahead of the meeting itself. So what we can also move into is questions quite rapidly. I just wanted to ask if Peter Davis or Jonathan wanted to add any particular overall points before we go into questions, and if so, now would be a good time.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, nothing further to add. I think Rachel's been through things in quite a comprehensive manner, and in the way that you're intended to structure the scrutiny today, I think I'll come in as needed to provide any comment in those relevant sections. So thank you.
Great, thanks. So I'll open it to questions from colleagues online or in the chamber. And as you're pondering on those questions, can I possibly ask one? There is Councillor Bond.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you very much for such a comprehensive presentation. Thank you, Peter and Rachel. Really, the first question, the first section that Alistair identified around the impacts really to the actual changes and how that'll show up in the services that we deliver. So I guess that's a lot of detail, and we discussed earlier about the fact that this is going to every scrutiny meeting, so therefore you can go through the detail of each of those items on 3.12 one by one. So I don't know how whether that'll come out with more information or whether it can be shared now. I guess you've got to have the relevant officers for the relevant areas to get the detail. I don't know whether that's
Councillor
enough of a question.
Sorry.
Does that make any sense? Thank you.
Councillor Garrick, did that make sense?
Yeah. So I think essentially you'll have seen the report, and it is over 1,000 pages of impact assessments of the future generation assessments and the proposals itself. So my expectation is that we discuss the areas that you would like to explore at this stage specifically. I think trying to cover every single one, and I can assure you that we have done that several times in Cabinet, and it did take days. Might be a bit challenging on us in terms of wrapping up by midday.
Thank you, Councillor Garrick and Councillor Bond. Councillor Chandler.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Thanks, Councillor Garrick. Obviously, there's a lot we could dive into here into details, but
as Councillor Bond said, I don't want to duplicate maybe what would be happening in other scrutiny committees. But I think there are a number of areas, I suppose, where at a top level I've got concerns at this part on looking at the revenue side and the proposed cuts. And a lot of that is to do with levels of confidence about our ability to deliver the savings that are in there, the risks that are involved in the proposals, but also the collateral impacts of some of the areas, because going into depth in those budget papers, clearly each individual cost saving has its own several pages of proposals and description and impact assessments and things like that. But I'm not getting the sense of where those come across and go together. So without wanting to drill into individual areas that might be covered tomorrow at People's Scrutiny, if I'm looking at, for example, in SCH5, which is about reducing 15 staff.
That's Ian Chandler, Edward. Huh? That's Ian Chandler
Pardon?
speaking.
That's the wrong one.
Yeah, so SCH5.
Sorry, Councillor Chandler, I don't know where that extraneous voice came from. I couldn't see it on screen either, but please carry on.
Anyway, so talking about reducing 15 staff from adult social care, and then there is the risks and assumptions seem pretty blank in that. But if we look at then what that impact might be on SCH6, which is talking about an increase of 16 staff in order to reduce falls and residential placements. There's no sense about how those two go together, because if the first one is reduced, there's a lot less, it does talk about less assessments, less OT support, less other things there that might actually impact on our ability to deliver the falls prevention strategy, which delivers the savings that come out in SCH6. So I'm just talking about that as an example of those cross things. I just want to see how that's done. I think within that, of course, there is a key risk that was not acknowledged in SCH5, as there is no head of adult social services in post. So the ability to deliver some of those redesign areas when we don't have a head of department to deliver it, that wasn't featured in the risks or the assumptions, and I'm a little bit concerned about that. So I suppose those are things there. I've got another one. The paper talks about getting a fees and charges, getting an increase of 1.4 million in that. There's no breakdown of that. That's quite a large figure, and without going through every individual paper, it will be good in that top level summary if we saw a little bit of a breakdown about where that 1.4 million is coming from, and then we'll come to capital and stuff later and medium-term forecasts. I suppose my...
Sorry, Councillor Chandler, I was playing a little bit of catch-up then. Which bit was that 1.4 million referring to, just so I can...
Fees and charges, which I think is in the actual summary paper, not in the detailed budget papers. And then I suppose my final point really is that residents in my ward and across the county have already raising concerns, and when they're looking at some of these figures, what they're always talking about is not, why are we making savings in some of our service delivery, when they look at the size of our budgets under the chief exec's unit, resources, people and governance, corporate costs and levies, which add those together, that comes to about £50 million. Now, from a resident's point of view that doesn't necessarily understand how budgets are constructed, that looks a huge amount of money, and there doesn't look to appear to be much savings being delivered in those areas. I just wondered whether you could explain a little bit more about that and perhaps give us some tools to justify that situation when we're talking about cuts to services. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Chandler. There are quite a number of points or questions in there, but it's fair to group some of these together. So I'll ask Councillor Garrick and Peter Davis, Jonathan Davis, to respond. So first of all, Councillor Garrick.
Okay, so can I just clarify what you meant on that budget breakdown? We've got the democracy, planning and people is at 4.8 8 million. You mentioned 50 million. What were you totaling there?
Sorry, in terms of the consolidated budget, figure 4, if we're looking at corporate costs and levies, people and governance, chief executive's unit, resources, and treasury. From a casual observer, that's coming up to about £50 million. And so what is our explanation to a casual observer about why that is so high and why the majority of the savings aren't happening in those areas?
A lot of that is to do with the amount of savings that have been made in those areas previously, leaving a lot of them at very much base on what can be plucked back. So we've looked at things like redundancies, we've looked at things in terms of how we can contract. And we've previously had discussions, I think particularly at Cabinet, about risk concerns on what we need to actually provide an adequate service as a council competently. And essentially, a lot of that answer is if we pare back more people, and it is mostly people from a lot of those services, then it becomes incredibly difficult to actually provide a competent service. I think you deserve a much fuller answer in terms of the levies, etc. So I'm going to hand that over to either Pete or John at this point, who will give you much more information at that stage, if that's okay.
Just before we do, Councillor Garrett, just on this particular issue, because I think it's a really important issue for our residents to understand, as well as our committee and councillors. I suppose at the heart of this is how much is what residents might think of as back office, and the cost of the back office in any organisation in our council compared to the frontline services. And I suppose, Councillor Chandler, that's kind of at the heart of where your question's going, that we're able to explain to our residents, if they ask the question, as they may well do, you know, we're seeing all these proposals for increases and council tax, but cuts in services. How much of our organisation is back office, and how does that compare to other local authorities in a way that might be seen to be reasonable? I suppose that is something that would be really useful just to get your thoughts on, just before Peter.
Yeah, I am going to hand this over to Peter, I think possibly Matt, in terms of the back office stuff as well, because they will give you a much more direct, clear response on those figures.
Okay, thank you. Peter.
Thank you, Chair. So I think Rachel, as she was taking you through the presentation earlier, I think there was a slide that was brought up that was, I guess, a pie chart that represented the council spend. And clearly the lion's share, or 2/3 of that, is taken up by schools and education. And then to Councillor Chandler's point, a very valid point, I think, as the Chair himself recognised, you know, there's a whole plethora of other services, and if I carry the use of the word back office functions that sit beyond that, that obviously keep the council running effectively and efficiently and safe and well governed. But I think it's probably just important to just recognise, even beyond schools and social care, you know, there are significant elements of the budget that relate to what I guess what we call, in terms of our directorate structure, communities in place. So that's a lot of the operational frontline services. But beyond that, leisure, culture and heritage services that sit under the branding of Mon Life, our leisure centres, and beyond that, you know, the remainder of the budget captures those as well, as it does in terms of all of our community hubs, our libraries, etc. Stepping beyond that, and again to Councillor Chandler's point, I'm sure you'll recognise that you know, we have treasury costs to meet in terms of the ongoing cost of borrowing, where that's been used in previous years to support our capital programme. And we do have the responsibility to pay precepts and levies, whether that's to Gwent Police, to the South Wales Fire and Rescue Authority, to drainage boards, etc. So these are very much sort of fixed costs that I guess are imposed on the council by statute or otherwise. And you would naturally expect that we have within the core of the organisation teams that are responsible for maintaining oversight of performance and the effective running and good governance of the organisation. Paying bills, recovering and receiving income, etc., etc. So I think at the heart of your question there as to, and I think maybe the chairs or Councillor Chandler's, as to whether we're in any way out of kilter with other authorities. No, we're not. Each local authority will have a very similar sort of breakdown of cost in terms of the broad array of services that are delivered. So I think just in terms of that's the specifics of that question, I think there were two other questions that Councillor Chandler highlighted. I'll wait for Councillor Chandler to come in, but maybe just to line up a couple of other officer inputs. So maybe I think specifically to your point of impact on adult social care, I'll ask Jane to come in a minute. Yeah. And equally, just in terms of the fees and charges point, I'll ask John to come in just to talk to where that detail is. But Councillor Chandler, if you want to come back in on my first point.
Just to come back in on the if we use it, the back office costs or the non-direct service delivery costs. I mean, obviously, I have a good handle on the budgets. We've been going through budgets in this group and in Governance and Audit Committee quite a lot. So it's more in terms of actually how we're explaining this to the public in terms of that. When we look at some of those tables where it is all lumped together, it just looks like a frighteningly large figure without any explanation. And we're talking a lot so in Councillor Garrick's presentation, there's a lot there about whether it's libraries or leisure centres or schools and things like that, but there's no real mention of those other things because we're not talking about cutting them because they're almost like fixed costs, the precepts and the levies, but they need an explanation, I think, in terms of this, and I need a sort of a more resident-friendly form of words in order to explain this rather than moving into detailed budget speak when I'm trying to talk to some of my residents about, why it is that the adult social care is being cut and, the chief executive's unit isn't being cut or isn't being cut that much, that type of stuff. I just need that type of more resident-friendly messaging for that. That we can take forward. So that's what I meant on that. It's not that I was necessarily challenging whether we could squeeze yet more money out of some of those areas. It's about actually how we're talking about it.
I think it's fair to say that as you single out the Chief Executive's savings proposals are included, they're not insignificant. But Peter, were there any particular points you wanted to just follow on there?
I don't think so in terms of specifics and detail. I think I'll refer and look back into Councillor Garrick's initial response to Councillor Chandler. I think it's the recognition, as Councillor Garrick talked to in her presentation, that we've taken down a very significant level of savings year on year, certainly from 2010 onwards, and as a council, talking to the point of comparison with others, we are incredibly lean, and our funding base is such that we've had to always be very resourceful in trying to maintain frontline service. So I think it is very much the case where all services have had to identify and bring forward proposals for savings, and I guess Cabinet's role, and to what Councillor Garrick talked to, that level of risk assessment to understand matters of deliverability and risk and other types of risk, that's got to be very carefully understood. But those back office functions that you talk to are incredibly lean, and we've got to be very careful in terms of maintaining the safe and effective running of the organisation. So which I think is what Councillor Garrick talked to. But I think, Chair, it's a conversation that could be opened up into a great level of detail, but I'm not sure that's going to possibly help where you want to focus your scrutiny today.
Thanks, Peter. And I think part of the dilemma here is that there is a formal budget report, which is not really resident-friendly. Resident-friendly, it's not friendly, because it's a lot of material and it's very dense, and a lot of it is in local government terms, which alone is almost a vocabulary of its own. But the presentation material does help really get across some of those messages, and I suppose we definitely want to be pointing residents to where they can actually find information that's digestible. I had a few questions as well, if I may add those. I notice Powys County Council are consulting on a 5% increase, and I do wonder how straightforward, indeed straight, we are being with residents in blurring the percentage to appear to be the age-old petrol price thing of, 1.49 rather than 1.5, and price points being what they are. I do wonder if it's much clearer and much straighter to say 6%. And it is interesting that Powys are consulting on 5%. It was also interesting, and I wondered your thoughts on this, that some of our other neighbours, so Powys at 5%, Herefordshire are consulting on 4.99, Gloucestershire on 2.99, well, let's call them 5 and 3, Turvine on 1.95, and I just wondered your thoughts on being the higher end of those immediate neighbours, and in some cases by some distance, and how we would, again, justify that with residents. I was interested in your thoughts on potentially protecting the services that we offer within communities by developing a programme of community assets, community ownership of specific assets, which might be from hubs to libraries to other facilities, where communities could take, in an organised way, ownership and potentially run those services for either maintained or extended hours through voluntary individuals and groups within those communities. And the extent to which that has been explored or developed isn't clear to me. I was also interested that the pressures have grown from the previous look that we had at this, from 23 million to 26.6 million, and interested in your views on whether or not that is caused by a delay in taking action in this current financial year that would actually have reduced some of the pressures for the next financial year, and therefore potentially some of the cuts. And just finally, and I'm bundling a few of these together, and I do appreciate that you're being patient in that regard. Again, on this point of just being straightforward with people, if we are making cuts to services, I would strongly welcome that we set that out clearly so that people can actually see what's happening. Nobody wants these things to happen unless it's done in for beneficial reasons. But equally obscuring it behind language that doesn't make it clear, I think, is it opens up another potential level of not just obscurity but potential criticism. And I would really welcome the use of clear language. So if we're talking about the Gwent music subsidy, that, as you were saying, Councillor Garrett, that we cannot do it this year, does that mean it's being programmed for future years? Are we actually saying that's now gone? When we talk about fairer prices, when we actually mean higher prices, again, the language and the way that we get this across, I think we need to not fall foul of criticism as a council that we are putting a sort of marketing spin on what might be bad news for individual groups, but actually to be straightforward with them as much as possible. Be interested in your responses on some of those. First of all, Councillor Garrick.
Sure. So I think on the first point, in terms of whether you got a percentage, you're talking about it's about £30,000 worth of 0.05% of a increase. Perhaps we should have challenged that. We didn't challenge it last year when we put in the 2.95% increase, and the modelling was set at 3.95%, and we've had to increase that. It's something the council has done, and we could go to the whole percentage points. It doesn't seem unreasonable. In terms of community open ownership, so we very much do community ownership in areas. I could cite the drill hall in Chepstow as an example of that. One of the things that is difficult to do is actually place it in a budget in terms of what the risk is there and how long that will take. It's unlikely you're going to get an instant solution and saving. You've got to find members in the community and groups in the community that would be prepared to do that. You need to work at it. It's a very unstable saving to put in for an immediate in-year saving. It's something absolutely we can work to and have worked on other areas in year, but it's not something we could rely on as a saving realistically for the planning of the actual in-year budget. So you also didn't like the language in terms of how we're asking people to pay for their services. I maintain we are asking residents to pay a fair price for their services. I don't think anybody anywhere in the county is under the illusion that a fair price is anything but an increase given the cost of living crisis and the levels of inflation. I think the language is completely adequate.
Thank you for the responses. I don't know, Peter, if there were any points that you wish to add to that?
And also just reminder that 3 out of 4 of my points haven't been answered yet.
Did you want to come back on those, Councillor Chandler? Please.
I'm happy to take them if you'd like.
They were due to talk about the...
I did notice there was a flow.
Yeah, because Peter only managed to answer one of my questions, not the other 3, so yeah.
Okay, so shall we, John, we had the question about fees and services and how those total up. Can I ask you to come in on that one, please?
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Garrick. Within the budget papers, and I appreciate there was a lot of detail shared. There is a detailed breakdown of the fees and charges. Those are split out over directorates and then further over the types of services that we are charging for. You will notice within the social care mandates that there is a separate mandate for social care charging, which goes into some detail around that. So, yeah, I appreciate it's mentioned in a few places, but I think the main block of information will be in Appendix 1 of the papers, and there are links there through to the full schedule of fees and charges totalling the increase of £1.4 million.
Yeah, I suppose my point on that is that, again, it's for some of the other figures in that section that we're talking about the sort of the tens and hundreds of thousands of pounds. That one suddenly it's 1.4 million and there's no breakdown. So rather than relying on us and members of the public to then drill down into all of those, 1,000 pages of individual, savings reports, it would have been helpful to have had a bit more of a breakdown on that 1.4 million in the top level paper. That's what I was suggesting.
I think it's worth taking your point. That paper was subject to a lot of feedback and comment, and we did try to keep the paper more concise than it was originally, and we have taken a fair bit out as a result of that. So thanks for that, and we can definitely take that feedback.
And I think it plays into that earlier point or question about are we being as straightforward as we need to be? Because it could appear that we're obscuring that information, and fees and charges are obviously going to be of interest to residents. Councillor Chandler, were there any other points that you feel you've not yet been responded to?
Well, yeah, there was the issues that I illustrated in adult social care, but it was more of a general point about confidence levels, risk, but also the collateral impacts of looking at cuts in one area and what does that do in terms of pressures into another area. So those were the areas that I was worried about.
Okay, thank you. And Councillor Garrett?
So I think a lot of those do genuinely sit in the social care area. I've asked Jane to line up to specifically address SCH 4 and 5 and generally how those impacts of those savings that are being proposed do interact. I'm aware that both Jane and Tudor, as the Cabinet member as well, have spent a very long time analysing what their proposals are, how they interact and what those impacts are.
Thank you, Councillor Chandler. And Jane, I hopefully you can hear that and you're able to respond to that.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, just to say generally around, I'm just checking, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Yep.
Just to say generally the point around the mandates that have been put forward for adult social care, there's no denying that there is significant challenges within that, but Councillor Garrick is correct to say that we've spent a lot of time trying to think of the best way of generating some savings for the council, but without creating an undue level of risk for individuals. And I think that the context is really important for me to talk to in the sense that over the last 2.5, 3 years, we have been in a very different context with adjusted priorities because of the pandemic, where preservation of life was at the forefront of all our operations. But now, although we still face really significant challenges, this is the time now where it is also the point where we have to regroup and really get back to our strategic priorities, which is around early help and prevention, something that we couldn't do as much of during the pandemic, enablement and re-enablement and partnership working, and using strengths-based approaches. And so whilst we have a huge challenge within social care and health, we hear about it in the media all the time, our job now really is to get back into supporting practice that supports people to live as independently as possible with minimum reliance on expensive packages of care, and ensuring that every pound and penny that we have is used in the most cost-effective way by really trying to develop and expand the types of care provision that there is. So, in each of those mandates within social care, there is going to be the need for us to review, assess individual people that are already receiving packages of care, people that are still, yet to come into our system. We won't compromise on safeguarding, but we will be really challenging ourselves to think, are we enabling that person to the best effect so that we can reduce some of the costs on care? Are we really utilising digital technology, aids and adaptation so that we're, again, enabling people? Are we getting in early enough within people's journeys, both to prevent hospital admission, to effect speedy discharge? And, we can't do this alone. This is really about joining up with our partners in health, using all our collective resources, both within third sector, our provider agencies, and, of course, primary and secondary health to maximise that opportunity to all pull together in the same direction. And if we can support people to avoid hospital, to going into hospital where they don't necessarily need to. They might be able to be supported in their own homes. If we can support people to get out quickly from hospital, it means that they are likely to need less expensive packages of care. So it's there's a huge task, but we have lots of ideas and lots of opportunities really to get back into preventative and reablement approaches, continue with innovation, so that we're really ensuring that although we've got an uphill battle to generate these savings, we're not without ideas and we're not without ways of being able to mitigate those risks, both in impact on people and achievability.
Jane, thank you for that. And I think all of us recognise just how challenging it is, but the very responses that you've provided, they do highlight that the expectation that we work in broad terms more effectively, or that we work in broad terms better, must leave some significant risk around that. And I think we can see that in the strategic risk register. So I think it's something we'll obviously want to keep a very close eye on as these services deal with many of the most vulnerable people. I'm conscious of time, and I'm looking to bring this section, which is the items 1 to 4, to a conclusion by 11:20. We've got questions from, actually, one area that hasn't been responded to is the knock-on issues, the consequences of taking action. And perhaps that's something that we can pick up as we go through this, Councillor Garrick and any other colleagues in the chamber. For example, if you cut, as you've identified, the number of phones or people answering phones in contact centres, where do residents go with their problems, and does that not create a bigger logjam somewhere else? So it's, I think, Councillor Chandler's point about what's the knock-on consequence of taking particular actions. Perhaps we can pick that up as we go through. But Councillor Murphy had a question.
Yes, thank you, Chair. My question's really around some specifics in either the savings or the increases in charges. And just to set it out right at the beginning, I absolutely get the need to get the money in this particular arena for long enough to understand all of that. But there were a few things that I think the public and particularly businesses will want to understand how the impact assessment was viewed. I know why we've got rid of the discretionary business relief, but again, I worry that might be called upon this time. The car parking charges, quite substantial increases. What about the impact on business? The pavement licences, a very small amount, but that could have quite a large impact on businesses. And with regards to education, the post-16 transport increases, the breakfast club increases could have substantial impact on families with several children. So as I say, I know why you're doing it. I just need to be sure that the public and businesses in general understand how the impact of it was assessed during your deliberations.
I suppose, if I may, Councillor Murphy, also it's the linked additional charges that any individual group might actually face. So the homeschool transport being one, but if the parents of a number of children may then face before breakfast school club increases up to £2 from £1, there's the linkage that may also be consequentially problematic. But Councillor Garrick, and if you'd be able to address those, please.
Yeah, sure. So in terms of business rates, and I do appreciate it was your group that asked for additional reductions on that. Welsh Government is essentially putting together a central fund for that at this point in time. In terms of car parking, we have very much scheduled a full review of car parking throughout the county scheduled for the next year, which will take into account the needs for each area and obviously the impacts on those areas, including business going forward. At the moment, there's a significant difference across the areas, which is a hangover from the 60s, where different regional councils had different parking approaches. So you see things where there's several areas in the west of the county which have free car parking, whereas in the east of the county it tends to be charged for. So we're going into full review on that this year. I think, what was your final question? It was the Breakfast Club impact. So yeah. And again, I'd point to what we're providing in that. I am part of a family that has several children. It's actually quite rare to see another family with several children using a breakfast or after school club. What we do find, but we do need to appreciate is that what we are providing is very, very low cost wraparound care there that is still facilitating. So you're still looking at about £6.95 a session for an evening session, and we're looking at 20% of that at £2 a session.
I'm not sure I got the maths on that one, but the is just to recognise that
it's about a third, isn't it? Sorry, my mistake.
It's just to recognise that there is clearly a concern that there may be consequences for people who are caught by multiple increases, as well as the knock-on effects. I'm going to move on to a question from Councillor Murphy. Were there any points that you felt you needed to follow up on?
No, that was pretty well what I expected, but I don't think people will be that satisfied with the response, but I do understand it.
So I'm going to move on to Councillor Pavia. I think you had a question.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. I suppose it's following up on Councillor Chandler's questions, really, in terms of understanding how realistic some of these savings are, particularly in social care and education. I mean, given where health and social care is, not just in a county regionally, but across Wales, pandemic impact is still being realised. The complexity of citizens engaging with statutory service now is more complex. I think in all the information that we're putting out in papers, that's being emphasised. So to try and understand, particularly in adult services, what are we saying about resizing direct care? Is that raising thresholds? Is that rationing of care? What's the actual realisation of that? Because we're already carrying a significant shortfall in hours for domiciliary care that need to be plugged. So what is the rationale for that? Similarly with children's services, there may have been families on the edge of care prior to the pandemic who've been tipped over. Certainly the cost of living crisis is impacting on those families. We may have families who've been unknown to statutory services that are emerging that require support. So, if we're saying reevaluating current processes in a round of high cost places, we know there's insufficient placements. Welsh Government's implementation of elimination of profit, while it's certainly admirable in terms of principle, it is having a destabilizing impact on what is an already fragile market. So what are we saying in terms of what is the impact there in terms of decision making around high cost placements and risk? Is that more? Are we looking to place children more in unregulated placements? What does that mean in relation to our engagement with CIW? More emergency calls in relation to those short-term placements. So it would be good just to understand that a little bit more. I suppose one question for Councillor Garrick and Peter, in terms of what both the Bank of England and the OBR are saying about this transitory nature of inflation. Now, we will see a significant fall over this next year, potentially going negative in the start of next year. So what are the assumptions being built in terms of taking the pressure off services, taking the pressure off budgets in relation to inflation. In terms of ALN reform, and I think when Welsh Government brought it through, the understanding was it would be relatively cost neutral, but it's clearly not the case. So is there been any additional money in the RSG that we're getting from Welsh Government to pick up some of that cost? And if not, what pressure are we putting on Welsh Government to realise there is additional pressure and funding shortfall for ALN reform, and what are we doing about that? In terms of education, again, education.
Sorry, Councillor Pavey, we're simply going to be running out of time if we have a very long stream of questions. We're already over the time that I was aiming for this section. Could I please just ask in Councillor Carrick's responses, we recognise that we are not the Place Committee, we're not the People Committee, and I don't want us to lose the focus of our committee, so we should be looking at, and it's perfectly appropriate for us to be looking at the impacts overall and the shape and the reasons for those decisions. But I don't want to go down into the greater detail, if Councillor Pavia would forgive me on this, that I would be expecting Place and People to be looking at in significantly more detail. But could you take those questions with that in mind, please?
Yep, sure. So let's deal with the Bank of England inflation piece first, very simply. We've got the OBR forecasts in the medium-term financial planning. You asked on realism on savings. You mentioned education as a primary concern. Education savings are incredibly firm. There's a huge reliance in there on the individual school's budget, so there's no target in terms of savings there. I'd say education is possibly one of the areas that has the lowest risk of realisation. We're also ensuring that with our targets this year, we're avoiding some of the mistakes that have been previously made. So we're not seeing consultant-led targets being put in place, which we saw for, I think, car parking and traffic enforcement, which has led to significant losses over the last year's budget with, I think every single outturn report has mentioned the lack of realism in those targets. We're very, very aware of that. We're also aware of the realism on the targets of things such as uptake of membership for Mon Life. So we are bringing a lot of realism in there. I think at that point, I need to realistically ask Jane to give us a brief response on the social care piece that you went into.
And Jane, I'd be grateful if you could keep it brief. I realise that we could get into a lot on this, but thank you.
I'll endeavour to do that, Chair. Thank you very much. So starting with the children's, I think I would just want to state that there is a lot of work ahead of us in really rebalancing our use of children's placement so that the majority of our children are placed with in-house Monmouthshire foster carers, and if we can achieve that, we will make the savings that are required. In relation to the question regarding adult social care, I would, really reiterate the points that I raised formally. This is formally, I should say. This is really about getting consistent approaches, using all the mechanisms that we have within the Social Services and Wellbeing Act to really assure ourselves that we're working with people through a strengths-based approach with a focus on enablement and prevention, and where we do have to provide care, sometimes for very complex people with very complex needs. We're making maximum use of assistive and digital technologies, and we're expanding our care options so that we get the best value for money that we possibly can.
Thank you, Jane. It's a challenging area. I appreciate that indeed. Councillor Pavia, was there any element there that you wanted to come back on?
Yeah, in terms of education, I was just going to flesh out that, in terms of some schools benefited significantly well. Education across the piece benefited significantly well, but there were some schools already in deficit who would have been in a surplus position, potentially will tip back over into deficit. So I suppose a question to Nikki, because I did see Nikki there in the room. What is the assumptions in terms of those schools that potentially will fall back into a deficit position in relation to our expectations on them drawing on the money that that they've got? I know for my own school, potentially we're looking at further round of redundancies this coming year. It's a challenging position, but I just wondered if there's been any sort of forecasting about how many schools that might fall back into a deficit position.
So, Councillor Pavey, thank you. We're really going to have a very quick answer in this one, if anyone is able to give an answer. If not, I'll be asking for that to be followed up with a written response.
Chair, I'm happy to give a very brief...
Nikki, I beg your pardon.
Yeah,
sorry, I was looking on the screen and I see you over there. You're probably waving madly at me, but thank you.
No. Just a very quick answer. Yeah, there's 7 schools in deficit. When I've looked at the forecast next year, the budgets next year at a very top level, because we haven't got the detail at the moment. I'm anticipating for 210 primary, it's between 14 and 17,000 saving they would need to find for this. Looking at the balances that we hold at the moment, I don't foresee any more schools going into a deficit, but obviously there'll be other factors that play out, not just in terms of this. Okay, thank you.
It's a worrying time all round, I think, right across the community. I'm going to move us on now, please, to item 5 for a brief look at this agenda item, which is the item 5, unmitigated budgetary risks being carried. And, we've already touched on this in part as we've been looking at the substantial section that we've been covering. I think one of the things that I'd be keen to have a response on is, for a resident, what do we mean by unmitigated risks in regard to what are extremely significant service budget savings? A reasonable resident might say, how could these be unmitigated? And I wonder if you could explain that, please.
I think I'm going to hand over to Pete and John on that to see if they can translate their professional language there.
Yeah, I think it's a very simple translation. I think when we use the word unmitigated, it is simply that it is not hard baked into the budget as it stands for 2023-24. And I think it's back again to Councillor Garrick's point when she was walking through the presentation. It's where we're going to need to assess that level of risk, and that level of risk obviously changes through time. It'll change from where we stand now to the point at which we work with Cabinet in bringing forward final budget proposals, and they will invariably therefore look to table those with Council. So we've got to take, so there will be an assessment, further risk assessments, plural, and as I've said, like a little bit like a broken record through, I guess, scrutiny here on the in-year position. One thing is for certain. It's the fact that a budget will evolve and it will change shape on a daily basis. So, we include our best estimates and assessment of risk in bringing the budget together, and Cabinet will obviously have to take some considered positions around that when finalising its proposals. And then obviously we move into next year. So to the extent that, I guess, risk is not hard baked into the budget, then clearly we're going to have to take an assessment around the level of reserve cover that we'll need to have against those risks, whether known or unknown at that stage. And Councillor Garrick talked to that when she was walking you all through the presentation. So that's probably both my explanation and my immediate input, I guess.
Thank you, Peter. Councillor Chandler?
Yeah, thanks. In Councillor Garrick's presentation, she said that there was £3 million worth of reserves that have been earmarked as contingency for risks. Given, you've in this section 5, you highlight 4 particular risks in terms of their pay awards and funding and redundancy costs and things. But given when we particularly look at the service budget savings, the level of high risk that is on a lot of those individual savings, particularly the high cost items. Small cost items actually seem to be lower risk, but the high cost items seem to be carrying a lot of risks, whether it's in terms of the ability to deliver the savings or whether it's in the ability to gain the external funding necessary to deliver the savings. And I mean, I've not done calculated them all up, but my instinct from having read through that is 3 million is not that much, given this year's over budgetary pressure. And I suppose I'm very worried that we're going to be here sometime later on in the year, going through a similar exercise to what we did last autumn, when we're suddenly saying, actually, we set this budget, but it was nowhere near big enough, and we're going to have to go through another process of cost savings in order to deliver that. So I suppose it's that really, is on what basis is that £3 million calculated, and how realistic is it, just looking at that overall level of budgetary risks?
Peter, did you want to address that, or Jonathan?
I'll probably make the Rachel in the opinion.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Garrett?
Okay, so I think when we say not enough, we need to be really realistic here. A 26 million shortfall and £11.4 million of savings. Nothing in this budget is enough. So yeah, £3 million is a lot, significantly driven by the availability of reserves. I'm going to hand over to Pete at this point to fill in terms of where we are on our ability to cover risks.
Thank you. Okay, Chair. I think a few points to make. So first off, I think it's just a recognition to your point of the in-year position. And I think that's been very well rehearsed within the chamber with the committee. And in terms of the speed and trajectory that's come at us, which has obviously impacted both in the in-year position as much as it has for 23-24. And I guess to that point, it's just important to note that the pressures that have come upon us, come upon the council in the current year, they are obviously all factored in. They are all inbuilt. They are, they significantly feature within that £26 million of cost pressure that Councillor Garrett talked to. So I guess that's a significant tick in the box in terms of dealing with that degree of risk. I think the Chair talked about earlier, just an acknowledgement that pressures had increased since I think we reported through Cabinet in the autumn, and again, the Scrutiny Committee presided over that. So again, that's taking an assessment, an updated assessment of levels of risk and cost increase that we've needed to incorporate. And again, these are all risk mitigation exercise to the extent that we're able to. Notwithstanding that fact, I think in terms of the £3 million reserve cover, that will be reassessed. Again, just to highlight the point, just in terms of one of the very specific responsibilities that I hold, away from Cabinet. But I hold a responsibility as a Section 151 officer, as a responsible financial officer for the council. I have a requirement to undertake that assessment, both of the robustness of the budget process, but most importantly here, the adequacy of level of reserves. So we've got to strike the right balance here in terms of the best understanding of that risk, understanding how robustly the budget process is accommodated as much as it is able to known risk. But clearly, we're not going to, in this current climate and environment, look to speculatively lay further cost pressures into the budget, which will have the impact of increasing council tax or increase in fees and charges or further savings needing to be made. But we're not going to do that if the assessment of that risk is such that it's not justified, and we need to ensure that we have reserve cover. But the £3 million is, accurately to your point, I think it is probably mainly against the deliverability risk that we carry. Social care is probably the area where that risk sits probably highest. And the reason for that is through no failing of the Cabinet in their judgments. It is simply the case, and I think Councillor Pavia recognised it earlier, it is a very dynamic and volatile and highly pressurised environment. And Jane has already talked to the types of change that she's looking to drive through both children's services and adult social care. We're just going to have to work with that and very closely monitor it. And I expect this committee, as we go into next year, to be doing that as part of the lens that will be applied on the budget monitoring.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Peter. And I suppose it just would leave what might be a reasonable observer wondering: are we kidding ourselves about social care budgets delivering the savings that we are expecting from the proposals, given the rising trajectories? And I suppose that just sits there as something we will need to keep a close eye on. Councillor Birch, I know you were looking to come in, and could I just say, and I know you've not spoken at all yet, so I am trying to see if we can ensure we have time for medium-term forecast and capital, but with that in mind, please do come in.
It was just to, if I can assist in answering the question about operational risk. I think Councillor Chandler is absolutely correct to identify it. If we can take as an example the situation with regard to homelessness, where we now have, an increasing number of people homeless. Our cost escalation is largely because we have an increasing number of people who are homeless, and we are housing them in extremely expensive provision in bed and breakfast. Our ability to bring down that cost per person, as it were, relies on some ambitious plans in terms of temporary accommodation and our ability to purchase that. And there are schemes and projects being worked up, which were set out in the community and corporate plan. If we're not able to deliver those within the year or make significant progress those, either because we lack support from Welsh Government or we lack support within the Chamber or through operational stops put on things, then we're not able to bring down that cost per person. Even if we are able to bring down that cost per person, then there is the absolute possibility that the economic situation out there and the situation with regard to our local housing market will mean that we have more people becoming homeless.
Thank you, Councillor Birch. It's the other knock-on factor that if we don't do certain things, costs could actually grow, and it's a very relevant point. In terms
I think
of
that we have similar challenges within social care with regard to service redesign, and with regard to your earlier point about community organisations, there are, as I'm finding, all kinds of partnerships between community organisations and this council, and our challenge is to ensure the appropriate deployment and mobilisation of volunteers and the community, and to understand where we need to be a provider and where we need to be an enabler. But I do think we have to be mindful of the pressures on community organisations, many of which are struggling to, in terms of our community halls, struggling to keep the heating and the lighting on and get enough bookings without us asking them to step up or contribute more for services they receive from us.
Thank you, Councillor Birch. That question, I think, was very much about community asset transfers as much as it was about fantastic communities that are incredibly engaged right across our county. I'm just conscious of time. I can see some hands have gone up, but I am going to move us on to medium-term forecast and issues relating to item 6 and that, to be sure that we're covering the ground. Councillor Chandler, I think your hand is a legacy hand on the screen just now. Councillor Bond, were you able to link your question to medium-term forecast creatively?
Well, Thank you, Chair. Well, mine's more of a general question about the council tax and whether can I ask that one?
Yeah, please do. Go ahead.
The level. Okay, it's a general. So I wondered how it was actually determined and assessed to come to the 5.9%, and is it related to what would be acceptable to us as members and our residents of Monmouthshire that we represent? And would it be acceptable, second part of the question, to ask the members here, or the members, if it would be preferred if it was increased, and then we could reduce the need for the cuts or changes?
Just to say on that, Councillor
in relation to the questions being asked so far.
Thank you. Our job is not to answer questions, but to ask them, and it's certainly not to set policy, and that will be for a cabinet to determine. So
could we answer the first part then?
The first part, could we understand? And I think very much at the heart of that is, do we start with the price point and work backwards, or do we build up to that from the pressures? Councillor Garrick?
We absolutely worked up from it through the pressures. This committee did put on some significant pressure to try and get an early number out of us, which we weren't able to give because we were not prepared to set that from a ideological idea of how much that be. We have very much done it as an informed piece on where the pressures are. We've also taken into account what we believe that our residents could countenance in terms of a very, very strong and difficult cost of living crisis as well. So essentially, we have gone from working up where our pressures are, where we can relieve those pressures, where we can make savings, and where we believe residents are able to do it. I'm aware that other councils are looking at higher, some are looking at lower. Those that are looking at lower are very much looking towards reserves, which we don't have in the same levels as well. I'm also aware that we are a minority administration and we are very much reliant on what every councillor in the council would be prepared to accept as well. So we're also dictated to by that.
Thank you, Councillor Garrick. And I'm sticking with the medium-term outlook. It's clearly a little bit of crystal ball gazing in such volatile times, and we do recognise that this is a very difficult period. The forecast, however, is looking at over the course of the years through to 26-27, modelling from the round number 6% proposed for this year council tax, moving to round numbers 4% for the following 2 years, and for the following 3 years, which would take us in compound terms towards 20% increase, so a fifth increase over the council tax band D for for all bands for the medium term for our residents. Interested just how you feel that places us at the end of that period, what sort of a county we would be, in what sort of a shape we would be, and are we injecting enough of positive strategy into the broader shape of the medium-term plan that actually is not simply a death by 1,000 cuts and we end up where we end up by the time we get to 26, 27, battle-worn and battle-weary. So is there enough of a positive strategy behind it? Could I ask those questions, Councillor Garrick?
I think we're already battle-worn and battle-weary in terms of deaths by 1,000 cuts over the last 12 years. And unfortunately, we're now in a position where we've had austerity underfunding of councils, and we're now at a stage where we're faced with a bumper year in terms of inflation. In terms of that 3.95%, it's a number that is the standard input for the medium-term financial plan. It's the same one that was used the previous year. It's likely to be adjusted as we get closer to each year end and go into our financial planning and have a greater clarity on where we will be.
Thank you. And Councillor Webb.
Oh, thank you, Chairman. I've had terrible difficulty in contacting this morning. Thank you, Councillor Garrick, for your explanation, your presentation. Thank you very much. It was just a general point, really, Chairman. I would really like to see town and community councils involved. They can precept and they aren't capped at the moment, and particularly in relation to village halls and situations in general. I think their involvement and their actual participation and knowing what our budget is and the problems that we're having would be really good, and just something for you perhaps to consider, Councillor Garrick. Thank you.
Councillor Webb, thank you for that. It's also something that came up from Councillor Murphy in the pre-meeting as an issue that prompted a discussion around that, and recognising that there's huge variability across our communities in terms of the precept. Some seem to really embrace it as enabling them to be able to carry out specific work or particular activities, and others possibly resisting, but I think quite often simply not aware as much as they might need to be. And I suppose as councillors, we have a role in that too. So thank you for raising it. Councillor Garrick. Oh, sorry, Councillor Webb.
For some community councils, all they are actually doing is paying the clerk, I have to say, not actually taking part in any particular projects and doing what they actually would be able to do if they precepted. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. And I'm sure you'll live to regret that comment from a few clerks. But anyway, Councillor Garrick, over to you.
No, thank you. I think what I can say is thank you. I will take that on board. Appreciate the input.
Councillor Chandler, I think you were first. Thank you.
Yeah, apologies for keep coming in. So now we're on the section on the medium-term financial forecast. I suppose I have to question the projections that we're looking at, the indicative base for 26-27 as being a deficit of nearly 223 million. Is that right? No, sorry, look at 23 million. That's quite an accumulative deficit. So what are the measures that we're looking at to get that onto a level to a more of a break-even figure? Because it just looks, worrying that shortfall is increasing each year. And there doesn't seem to be any measures in place where we're having that sort of medium-term look at this, unless it is just through increasing the council tax by more than the 3.95% that's in the model.
That might be something that Peter or Jonathan want to pick up. Obviously, Councillor Garrick, if you want to pick it up.
Oh, I'm quite happy to skip over to that. That's deep in the TFP, so I think that would be great.
Jonathan, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I appreciate the point that it looks a large figure in isolation. I think what we've got to appreciate is the further we go out, there's lots of uncertainties around inflation, interest rates, and the wider pressures that are going to be placed upon services. So we make an allowance within the model for those unknown pressures that will come forward. It's based on prior experience and trends that we've seen. But what we're hopeful of doing is in some of this transformational work around service redesign and changes is that we'll see a lower level of pressure come through towards the back end of the medium-term financial plan. And that that work going in at the front end will deliver that benefit as we work through. But I think we have to be mindful of the environment we're in with a high inflation at the moment, which yes, there are indicators that it will fall away quite quickly. But there's wider uncertainties then around pay awards and such like. That the further we go out in time, the less certainty we have. So we have to make some realistic estimations within this. But as I say, we're hopeful that the introduction of some of those service changes will have an impact as we go through.
Thank you, Jonathan. I'm going to move us to Councillor Murphy.
Sorry, could I just get clarification on that? Just so that my
briefly, if you would, Councillor Chandler,
because that in Figure 5 in 6.2 on the paper is so it's called a forecast, but you're saying it's more of a worst case scenario. Because that's I suppose it's the terminology that I'm thinking. Because if we're saying it's a forecast, we're predicting that this is what it's going to be, rather than saying this is what might happen if the worst happens. I suppose it's that. And if it is a prediction, why are we not also addressing that?
I think it's called the indicative base. I suppose that's very much a big part of it. But Jonathan, really briefly, if you would.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think I think we have to appreciate that we will have a medium-term financial strategy off the back of the community and corporate plan, and we'll identify ways of addressing that gap. As I say, it's based on our realistic estimations at this point in time. It will change month by month, year by year as we go through.
Thank you. Councillor Murphy, I know you had a comment that you, I think, wanted to raise for the previous question.
Yeah, it wasn't a comment as such. It's just something that flashed into my mind when Councillor Garrick said that she would be prepared to talk to, well, particularly community councils. Just from experience, going round the community councils over the years, I've been amazed at how many don't realise what the precept actually is. So you might just like to bear in mind that the precept isn't an allocation, which one particular community council thought it was. They said, well, we can't afford to do anything because we only get 2,500. So we had to explain to them what the precept was and how they could provide stuff, albeit that it does go on their council tax bills. So you might just like to bear that in mind. Don't assume that they know, because there's quite a few of them don't.
It's not like our children.
Thank you. That is the surprise to me, having been a town councillor previously, where we've gone through and analysed our budget and set our precepts. I was not aware that other community councils didn't apply that. So thank you. That's really useful to know.
Towns know, but not all community councillors do.
Yeah.
It's not like our children's pocket money, which is very much an allocation. But Councillor Griffiths.
Yeah, if I could just share a thought with members on the context of our medium-term planning and the projections which have been put out. We're clearly reliant on the forecasts, if you like, that have come from the UK government and then through to the Welsh government about what funding will be made available in future years. And I do think Councillor Chandler's phrase, worst case scenario, can often be applied in that the Treasury is not going to commit itself in future years beyond the very minimum which they think is possible. And then we have to work on the basis of that projection, and it makes very sombre reading when you do it. But as we found this year, governments move under pressure from their former projection to their actual allocation. So there will be movement. What's difficult for us is to plan from anything other than the figures that have been given, which may well turn out to be the worst case. But in that planning, I think we're learning all the time. We've learned from the pressures that are built up this year. The pressures came in significant part from the increased costs on complex care. They came from energy costs. In terms of the concerns on are the risks being managed, then all of those increased costs have been factored into this year's budget. But we're certainly not leaving it there, in that what we've realised is that whereas we can't change our service delivery overnight in response to those changes, we must change our service delivery over a period of time. So we will be and our director's been speaking, but we will be assertively working with others to reshape the market in complex care. We will be ensuring that alternative sources of supply, which can be better managed, are in place over a period of time. On energy costs, we have to respond. We have to pay the bills. We can't move to a more low energy service delivery overnight, but it must be our responsibility, and we're going to meet up to it, to make sure that we deliver services in far more energy efficiency ways as next year and the year after rolls out. So we're not entirely passive. We will be doing more than working on a year-by-year basis. We will be planning over a period of years to manage those known increasing costs.
Thank you, Councillor Griffiths. I'm going to move us on to item 7 to 11, and I'm going to group that with prudential and next steps, given the time, and ask colleagues for any points that they wish to ask about. So that is from covering capital 7 to 11 and prudential and next steps. If colleagues are considering questions, if I may ask a question about the relationship to in terms of next steps and how we move forward. Staff vacancy rates moving up to 3%. Would it be feasible for us to say that any staff vacancy that's been in place for 6 months simply is removed as a staff vacancy, just to reduce future pressures on our budget? And I don't know who wishes to handle that one, whether Councillor Garrick or Peter or Jonathan.
I think this is actually more for Matt, actually. Give us an idea of how many of those we actually have in place and how we're coping at the moment. Generally, if we need to, I think we're filling those spaces with contract provision, which might well be more costly. So, Matt, would you be able to step in?
Thanks, Matt.
Brilliantly, you caught me at a point that I just went and had to deal with someone at the door. So I'm so sorry, I missed the question.
It was about, would it be feasible, given the reductions in staffing, is it reasonable to look at all of our current recruitment activities and anything that's been open for the last 6 months, remove those as vacancies?
Yeah, basically any vacancy that's been in place for more than 6 months, would it not be appropriate to remove it to reduce future pressures?
No, I think in a word, no. And I'm speaking on behalf more of the kind of leaders and managers of the various departments and what have you. But when I think about a pinch point area like domiciliary care, for example, I think you could probably go on and find a number of posts being advertised at any one point, because that's where the demand lies. I think to simply take those as a vacancy would be unwise in terms of the impact it would have on service delivery. What it does mean, of course, is it places the focus on how do we recruit, how do we find our competitive advantage, what is it that we need to do in order to get these, really vital service delivery employees into their posts. And there's an enormous answer to that in terms of what it is that Welsh Government are doing with us nationally, the work that certainly people in the social care and health are looking at in terms of how they can recruit, even on an international basis. So I get the kind of the mathematical attraction of it, but it would be a hugely complex thing to do with a considerable impact on service delivery. So we will always look with roles that are potentially going and in restructuring work where we can redeploy and retrain people. Our apprenticeship, graduate and internship work is always, I think, is really real interest to me, because that's where you get the kind of next generations in, and it might sound old-fashioned to some, but I think it's a really positive piece of work that we've got. And then there is just the nuts and bolts of it, which is our recruitment process needs to be better. And we literally, I'm sat with emails coming in this morning, because we have procured a new e-recruitment system, and the implementation is being worked up on that, which will considerably improve both the automation of our processes, how people access it, how they engage with it, and then how we bring people into the organisation, train and develop them, and simultaneously a learning management system that will allow us to really invest and develop our people, which acts A as a kind of retention tool, but B, that's where you create an increased, well, productivity, frankly, both in terms of an increase in skill levels, the ability to take on leadership roles and what have you.
Thank you, Matt. Turning to the capital budget and pressures, a very big part of the capital budget is the new King Henry 3-19 school. Could you explain where the risk sits of, I don't mean Matt, I mean Councillor Garrick or Peter or Jonathan, where the risk sits in terms of cost overrun for the new school? The cost of building has risen so extraordinarily over the course of the last couple of years, and just interested to understand where the cost of any potential overrun might sit. Thank you.
Thanks. I did ask those questions in terms of how the contract was put together at the commencement of this process. I'm afraid that was some time ago, so I am going to bounce that back to Pete and John on this one.
Thank you, Councillor Garrick. So just very simply, because again, I know that we're pressed for time, but you know, the fundamental risk of price increases resides with the contractor, and in the nature of the way that the contract has been put together. There are obviously certain circumstances, even with a fixed price contract, where some risks fall back on the council, but clearly we work our way through that. Level of contingency budget has been appropriately factored into what is, as you well know, a very significant capital scheme for the council. So yeah, happy to take any supplementaries beyond that.
Thank you, Peter. And I suppose the additional question I'd be interested in finding out a little bit more about is, it's about 6 months now since the council moved and agreed to move this development forward. Are we on schedule? Is the schedule that we looked at then very much the one that we're still looking at now?
Based on my most recent update, which was a matter of days ago, yes. In terms of the construction completing on time and the school being opened as intended.
Thank you, Peter. Any other questions from members of the committee on capital or prudential or any other issues related to next steps? Councillor Murphy.
Just a comment. I think I'm right in saying, Pete, you'll correct me if I'm not, the sort of thing that could come back on us would be like excess asbestos in pulling the old building down, that sort of thing. Could that come back? That'll come back on us, won't it?
Certainly in terms of site clearance, and I think it's something that we've experienced and reported on both Caldecott and Monmouth builds. And again, to my point, the assessment of the level of contingency held took that into account, and based on those experiences.
Thank you. So I'm going to move us on as there are more questions, and I thank you, Councillor Pavey. I note that you have to leave for another meeting. Can I just ask for a point of clarification? I've had a question come through during the meeting. Councillor Garrick, you mentioned a large number of English councils announcing bankruptcies, and I just wondered which councils, or the question was which English councils?
I think you need to refer to the public domain for the number of councils and exactly which ones that have announced bankruptcy over the last few years. Okay.
I just wondered, because you specifically said that there were a significant number. I just wondered if you had any examples.
I'm sure you can find those in your own time. I'm afraid I would have to specifically look for them. But there have been several high-profile cases.
Okay, thank you. And I recognise that we are rapidly moving out of time. thanks very much for everyone's questions and responses during that part of the meeting. I would just note that our next meeting is now on the 27th, Monday the 27th of February, and you should have received diary invitations for that, colleagues, in the last few days, I think, from Robert. So thank you for that, Robert. And I move that we're not approving this report. This is a matter for the Cabinet and Council, but we are recognising that report has been scrutinised at this meeting. I also see Matt Phillips. You're, I think, are you looking to come in on the meeting, Matt, or is that something you want to do outside the meeting?
Sorry, Joe, it's just in response to the question about the bankruptcies and stuff, I've got some data on that I can pass on to you for the committee afterwards, if that's
Thank you. That would be really helpful. Thanks very much, just for reference. Okay, great. So I look forward to seeing you, colleagues, at our next meeting on the 27th of February. Thank you to Cabinet members who have taken time to attend the meeting and to respond to questions and to present. Councillor Garrick, it's incredibly important that we do have you here because it's our opportunity to be able to ask questions directly of you and for us to hear and understand better the reports that are in front of us. So thank you for ensuring that you make that time available. It's much appreciated, but very important. And thank you, colleagues on the committee. I look forward to seeing you again. Hopefully, it'll be a little less frosty, I mean, in temperature terms, rather than the mood and the atmosphere within the committee, which I hope is never frosty. But hopefully it'll be a little bit milder by the time we get into February. In the meantime, I'll see you then, and thank you for your attention. Bye for now.